So hello, Seattle City Council members. We're here today to present our risk assessment for particulate matter and asthma in Seattle children. So before we get into the bulk of the risk assessment, I just wanted to go over what exactly particulate matter and asthma are, even though this may be a review for most of you. So particulate matter is a mixture of solid particles and liquid droplets in the air. It's composed of particles with a variety of shapes, sizes, and compositions. So this can include things like soot, dust, smoke, oxides, anything like that. Furthermore, particulate matter can come from either natural or man-made sources, such as combustion sources, vehicles, power plants, fires, etc. So the graphic on the right shows kind of the different size distributions of particulate matter. So as you'll see, PM10 right here, this is compared to PM10. Those are considered coarse particles, so that would include dust or particles of that size. PM2.5 is considered fine particles, so this includes combustion particles and organic compounds, and then ultrafine compounds may be even smaller than that. And so just to kind of briefly review what asthma is, it's characterized by recurrent attacks of breathlessness, wheezing, coughing, chest tightness, and phlegm due to air passage and inflammation of the lungs. So asthma typically does start in childhood, but can affect individuals at any stage in their life. So the exact cause of asthma is actually unknown, but it's hypothesized to develop as a result of a mixture of genetic and environmental factors. And exposure to various irritants and substances that can trigger allergies can also trigger asthmatic symptoms. But briefly, just for clarification, we're not doing a risk assessment as to particulate matter in relation to causing asthma, but rather just particulate matter and its effects in terms of exacerbating asthma symptoms.
So there's been many studies that have looked at many epidemiology studies that have looked at the effects of short-term PM10 exposures on children with asthma, and they include increased emergency department visits and hospitalizations, asthma symptoms, the use of medication, and decreased peak flow rates. So we'll just focus on a couple that were based here in Seattle. And the first looked at fine particles in asthma emergency department visits. Data was collected for 15 months in 6 hospitals in the Seattle area. They also looked at daily air pollution levels of particulate matter, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, and sulfur dioxide. And what they found was that an increase in PM of 2.5 was associated with 2.5 of 11 micrograms per cubic meter was associated with an increase of 15% in childhood asthma emergency department hospitalizations. And this was true even after they controlled for hospital use rates, the day of the week, temperature, and dew point temperature. And the researchers also saw a significant association between carbon monoxide in this study, but not for any of the other pollutants that they sampled for. The second study also looked at ambient air pollution. This time they looked at symptoms of children with asthma in the Seattle area. So they looked at daily asthma symptoms of 133 children ages 5 to 13 living in the area with mild or moderate asthma. These children, these studies were controlled for age, race, sex, baseline, height, day of the week, season, and temperature. And so what these studies concluded is that PM1 of 10 micrograms per cubic meter, an increase in that was associated with an 18% average increase in asthma symptoms within each individual. And a similar exposure of PM10 was associated with an 11% increase of asthma symptoms within individuals. And finally, they also saw an association between carbon monoxide and increased asthma symptoms, and this is pretty large, and researchers believe that this was because carbon monoxide is a good biomarker for ambient levels of combustion byproducts that aggravate asthma, and this includes particulate matter. There's also been many toxicology studies that have looked at the effects of PM at the cellular level, and they include oxidative stress, inflammation, cytotoxicity, oxygen-free radicals, DNA oxidative damage. And so we'll talk about one of these studies that looked at PM, acute pulmonary toxicity of PM in rats. And so this study was essentially a follow-up study to many other studies that have demonstrated that after the closing of a steel mill in 1987, that there were reduced respiratory diseases in hospital admissions of nearby residents. So what these researchers did is they exposed rats to PM samples that had been collected while the mill was open after it had closed, and then after it had reopened. And so what they saw was that 24 hours after these exposures, these rats that had been exposed to this open mill, all these open mill samples had developed significant pulmonary injury, neutrophilic inflammation, and 50% had increased airway sensitivity. And 96 hours post-exposure, which is panel B, they saw some increased levels of neutrophils and lymphocytes, but most other effects had been resolved. And upon further investigation, they looked at the concentrations of these different exposures from these different PM exposures from before, while the mill was open, after it was closed, and after it had reopened, and they saw that there were, despite the metals being a very small fraction of the overall sample, they were still higher in the samples when the mill was open, and they believe that these metals may be responsible for part of the toxicity that they had seen in the rats. So these reports, this study was in sync with other epidemiologic reports of respiratory health effects.
All right, so there have been a number of in vitro assays conducted to look at how particulate matter interacts on a cellular level. So most of these assays have been carried out in human lung epithelial cells, including bronchial epithelial cells. So there have been a variety of different studies, and so what they do is collect particulate matter from a source, be it a city or some sort of combustion source, something like that, and then expose the cells to that. So overall, results have shown that particulate matter induces oxidative stress mechanisms in the cells. So essentially what this does is turns on pro-inflammatory genes. And that results in the release of cytokines, interleukins, and other cellular factors that are consistent with an asthmatic response. So the picture on the right shows a normal bronchiole, and then after these interactions on the cellular level, you would get an inflamed bronchiole like that on the right side. So just in general, the in vitro assays have shown that particulate matter does in fact elicit local and systemic inflammation in the lung. Now that being said, the pathway is still not fully understood. That's something that future studies will have to figure out. But parameters of importance in relation to the particle itself are going to be its oxidative potential, surface area, and size. So smaller particles are hypothesized to elicit more of a response. Also, it's important to mention that particulate matter sources are heterogeneous, so it makes in vitro assays a little bit challenging in terms of generalizing them to all places. As far as what we could find, there wasn't an in vitro assay that used particulate matter that was from Seattle or directly representative of Seattle. So yeah, mixtures vary based on source, location, and other factors, so you have to keep that in mind when interpreting these results.
So we'll move into the exposure assessment now. Starting with the dose response. This was a study that exposed male mice to a range of doses of PM 2.5 collected near a major freeway in Sacramento, which is a similar urban environment to Seattle. They found that they exposed them to 5.5, 27.5, and 50 milliliters of PM via oropharyngeal aspiration. And they found that the airways significantly decreased by exposure to samples of 27.5 and 55 milliliters, with 27.5 being the minimal dose. So our susceptible group our vulnerable group is children with asthma. And there's a few reasons why children are so much more susceptible to aggravation of asthma from PM pollution. First of all, their lungs, their immune system, and brain are rapidly developing from ages 0 to 6. As well as the cell layer lining inside of the respiratory tract is particularly permeable during this age. On top of that, since children are smaller, they have a larger lung surface area in relation to their body weight. They're breathing about 50% more air per kilogram. They also tend to spend more time outdoors doing strenuous activities such as playing sports, playing with their friends, as well as indoors versus an adult who spends about 90% more time indoors. So because of all these reasons, air pollution during these stages of development has such a more critical effect on children versus adults. So it's a little bit of statistic of juvenile asthma prevalence in Seattle. The highest areas are Beacon Hill and southeast Seattle with 493.1 per 100,000. Downtown and central Seattle with 419.9 per 100,000. As well as West Seattle and Delridge area with 337.8 per 100,000. The lowest areas are kind of the more suburban areas. Southeast King County is 61.2 per 100,000. Mercer Island in Point City is 93.5 per 100,000, and Vashon Island is 104.6 per 100,000. So the main pathway for PM to get into the body is through inhalation. All people are continuously exposed to PM to some extent, unless you're in a super filtered environment. Exposure is higher in urban and industrial areas due to an increase in the number of sources, but PM can occur in natural environments as well. Also, particles in PM 2.5 size range are able to travel deeply into the respiratory tract. So if you look at the chart, they enter through the mouth. The larger particles, such as PM 10, tend to be eliminated through coughing, sneezing, or swallowing. But the smaller PM 2.5 particles can travel deep into the lungs, causing long-term chronic problems.
So the major sources of PM 2.5 include vehicles, diesel engines, coal and natural gas power plants or industries, soon dust-producing industries, and smoke. This figure here on the left shows sources for general air pollution in South Seattle, but the main contributor to PM 2.5 is diesel. So that's like diesel locomotives, big rig trucks, and leaf blowers. A study looking at personal exposure for children in urban settings found that outdoors concentrations were 14.3 micrograms per meter cubed and 24.1 micrograms per meter cubed in homes. And indoor sources for home PM 2.5 are like fireplaces, stoves, and secondhand smoke. So if you live with a smoker, children are exposed. A big part of exposure assessment for air pollutants is knowing what your studied population is doing when. So one study looking at urban youth saw that 60 to 70% of their time was spent at home, 20 to 30% of their time was spent indoors but not at home, and about 10% of their time was spent outdoors or in transit. And this is important to understand because there are different PM 2.5 concentrations according to the location, so children experience different exposures as they move through space. And time can also factor into PM 2.5 concentrations. In general, there are higher PM 2.5 concentrations in the mornings and afternoons when there's rush hour traffic. Oh,
Sorry.
Overall, the children living within 500 feet of a highway experience significantly higher PM 2.5 exposures. So to bring it all together, we found that children with asthma are an especially vulnerable population because they are more sensitive and they experience more adverse health effects to PM 2.5. When they are exposed, we see increased asthma symptoms and increased hospital visits. So areas of concern for us are where they're exposed the most or where they spend the most time, which is schools, parks, and especially their own homes. And in these areas, we can target our recommendations or mitigative actions. So this map on the left, in the orange dots, you can see all the schools in Seattle. The red is the railway, is the BNSF railway, uses heavy diesel locomotives. And then blues are major arterials and major highways. There's the I-5 going right up there. The orange areas show areas of concern because they're about 500 and 1,000 feet away from these major sources. So here we found there are 7 K through 12 schools within 500 feet of major sources and 21 other schools within 1,000 feet. And then there are 60 parks or trails within 500 feet of these major sources and 20 other areas, parks or trails within 1,000 feet.
All right, so regulation of PM 2.5 or particulate matter in general is accomplished through the EPA's National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and it's adopted in the Washington Administrative Code. PM 2.5, the annual average is 12 micrograms per meter cubed, and the 24-hour average is set at a maximum of 35. And PM 10, the 24-hour average is a maximum of 50 micrograms per meter cubed. The World Health Organization has a slightly lower guidelines of 10 and 25 for PM 2.5, and 20 and 50 for the PM 10. So the PM 10 is much lower than we adopted the states. And in 1997, President Clinton signed out an executive order which said that the EPA and other federal agencies will focus and put high priority on identifying health and safety risks that disproportionately affect children. And so when they're coming up with regulations and standards, they're supposed to address that. So from 1998 to 2006, the EPA looked at just under 1,700 regulations, and 51% of those considered children's health. Of that, 430 were air regulations. 27% of those considered health or safety-based actions. So the 13 national ambient air quality standards that were looked at, 6 of them explicitly included consideration for children's health. So some of the conclusions out of our risk assessment is that the particulate matter exposure is ever present and involuntary. You guys are being exposed to PM right now, whether you like it or not. And there's no evidence of a safe level or threshold below which no adverse effects occurs. And so children are at risk. Increased PM is directly related to increased asthma symptoms and hospital visits.
Okay, so this is a huge information, you know, for us at our level, like, we wanted to leave you with a control method that, you know, we can take home for the presentation. You know, obviously there are a lot of recommendations that we can make for control method, but for this presentation, we wanted to kind of focus on public awareness kind of campaign information, like what can you do at home to help your children? So first of all, you shouldn't wait. Even though in Seattle we are kind of okay in our ranges compared to other cities, you know, you shouldn't. If you have a child at home that is suffering from asthma, you shouldn't wait to take steps. And like we talked about earlier, children are more at risk because they often spend more time outdoors, engage in activities and play, and they breathe more air per pound of body weight than adults. On average, a 3-month-old breathes 35 times more than average adults. And they're more susceptible to effects of air pollution because, like we mentioned earlier, they're still developing, and so that increases their risk. So things that you can do at home through behavior modification and incorporating HEPA technology, it's huge. So the air cleaners alone will not be able to prevent your children from being in the harm's way as much as you would if you would you know, take necessary steps, like don't burn wood or something like that to heat your home, fireplaces and things like that at home. Even candles and incense can be harmful. Don't smoke inside the house. Keep the room clean. HEPA filter is good to use with your vacuum because all the vacuum does typically is stir up particles that are already inside your home. The levels, I don't know if you guys caught that earlier, the levels inside the building or a room is typically higher than outside. Even though we do a lot more measures outside, those particles fly in. And if you think about it, a lot of people, you know, take those readings outside because it's public streets and whatnot, but they don't necessarily come into your home to do the reading. And whenever the weather's hot and you can't stay within the, you know, within inside with the windows closed, go somewhere where there's filtered air. If families cannot buy filters for the entire home, create a room for sleeping. So wherever room there is a few like exits or windows or things like that, it's a good candidate. You know, keep the windows closed and run air conditioner that does not draw air from outside and has a filter. If the AC provides fresh air option, keep the fresh air intake closed. Make sure that the filter is clean enough to allow good airflow indoors. And again, use the air filter in the room, avoid using air cleaner that works by generating ozone, because that just pollutes, introduces more pollutants in your own home. And children with asthma should avoid being out at peak traffic hours, like morning times or rush hour times. And when the air clears and the air quality index readings are low, take advantage of those times and get outdoors. And like Jekka mentioned earlier, preference to school furthest away from highways, because you don't necessarily want to stick your child, sitting in, like I said, when they open the door to ventilate the classrooms and stuff like that, all that stuff flows in, and your child breathes in all those PM.
So we should also take advantage of some of the public awareness information that is out there. So like the EPA has Dusty the Asthma Goldfish to help you teach your children about their asthma and the triggers and things that cause it. And then there's always the asthma action plan that the doctor provides. One of our recommendations is to include more information on that as to what you can do at home to help reduce the risk of particulate matter exposure.
So, we talked a whole lot about, the readings that were measured and what it's doing to our children. But, further study is really necessary because all these studies have been reactive. And we have found very little, literature on how to be proactive to prevent those kids from, having those emergency room visits and having those asthmatic symptoms. So future studies should focus on proactive measure for children and specifically identified evidence of safe level or threshold below which no adverse health effects occurs, as well as pathways. Even though inhalation was one of the main, all the literature wasn't very conclusive on like all the studies that they have done. And also the varying mixture, because having 2.5 come from like vehicular mode of transportation versus like industrial, like steel mill we mentioned earlier, the mixture is very different. So we need to be more aware of those varying situations and eliminate or reduce PM 2.5 emitters. 49%. That pie chart you guys saw earlier, about 49% was due to mode of transportation, 11% was industrial, 20% was wood burning. And by using alternative source and renewable energy, reduce the use of fossil fuel and wood burning to heat your homes. Update the Washington Department Health to School Indoor Air Quality Best Management Practice Manual. Current one doesn't really necessarily address the PM 2.5 specifically. It mentions a lot of pollutants, and it addresses a lot of like carbon monoxide and things like that, which is PM 2.5 is part of, but they don't single that out. And last decade or so, this has been more prevalent, so they need to do a little bit more study on PM 2.5 in particular. And how will we know when the conditions are better for children? As you can see, a lot of these are something that you can do yourself. You can take charge and make the surrounding better for your children. You don't have to wait till they destroy all the schools next to the highway, and take them out of school. You don't have to do things like that. These are things that you can do for yourself. And air quality conditions in Seattle can change rapidly, so constantly checking with the embassy, local air quality monitoring web pages for the recent 2.5 readings. Pay attention to weather forecasts to see which times are better for outdoor activities. And actually, this was kind of an interesting thing we found. EPA has an indoor air quality kit, like an action kit that you can have. It provides the best practices, industry guidelines, sample policies, and management plan. So those are something that you can have on hand to kind of educate yourself a little better. And these are just some links to not references for literature or scholarly articles, but something that you can use to kind of learn a little bit more about it, you know, as everyday person. And I don't know how Jesse knows how fish feels like without water, but.
I have to say, I was sort of wondering how the analogy with the goldfish was gonna come about, but apparently this is it, so that's good, out of the mouths of children. So did anybody use a call for questions? I was just wondering, I tried to use the link, but I didn't. Is it operational?
We're not sure.
Oh, okay, sorry, because I tried it, but I didn't quite get in, so, but did anybody try their link? Oh, okay, all right. It's one of the things.
You can do the
broken.
old-fashioned way.
The old-fashioned way. So who's in the discussing group? Rachel, I think you sent out nice notes to everybody.
Yeah, they know who they are. I see hands.
Oh, okay. Oh, good. Okay. So any questions? What are we gonna do?
So, I just had a question. So in your thing, you recommend the use of vacuum cleaners with a HEPA filter in them. And that's not quite true, because all vacuums have HEPA filters in them now, but they're not closed systems, so they do still just spit out dust. So you'd think you'd want to recommend maybe more of a HEPA filter with a closed system. So it's not a closed system, then there's really no point in having a HEPA filter in your vacuum.
Right. And I don't think all vacuum cleaners have.
Most of them do now. They all advertise HEPA filters.
So-
Even like
so,
$40
like
vacuums.
How many of us in here have a brand new vacuum with a HEPA filter?
Right. Right. So one out of the entire room. We actually have a child, and this is something we learned. We actually have a child with, asthma, 3-year-old, and our vacuum is the cheapest vacuum you can find on the shelf. I
Right,
have no
but
idea.
what I'm saying is like, if you go buy a new vacuum now and you spend $60, $70 on it, it will be advertised as having a HEPA filter in it, 100% of the time. So,
100% of the time.
yeah,
Okay.
they all have HEPA filters, but they're not
Okay.
HEPA vacuums.
Okay, that's
Good
good
point.
comment. Other questions for, yeah.
How is the risk of asthma characterized in anti-smoking campaigns? If you guys touched on that.
I think it's huge. I may be the wrong person to ask because I'm just anti-smoking, period. Like, I don't think you should be smoking at all.
But especially not around your child. Huh?
Yes, that would make me really mad. But yeah, and even me, I don't have asthma, but I'm allergic to smoke, so.
I think that's definitely something we can flesh out in our recommendations too, is kind of adding more of a component if that doesn't already exist to, if you do have a smoking home, which Seattle's, has pretty high levels of cigarette consumption, that's something we could definitely add in there.
Yeah.
So I was just looking at Allergy Buyers Club and their vacuums, their HEPA vacuums are between $300 and over $1,000.
Yes.
I can't afford
So,
that.
so these,
Yes.
so these types of recommendations can be quite costly.
Yes.
Are you promoting any type of government assistance or public funding to help families make these changes or businesses make?
So, we didn't quite maybe touch on this, but, so wet mop. So generally, carpet is not sanitary in homes like that, when you're trying to create a clean space. So wet mopping is what's recommended because it keeps, the dust level down. So I think, like I said, vacuum I have at home is the cheapest one on the market. And I think anybody will be, it'd be hard to force somebody to, have HEPA filter on all their air filtering system, vacuum cleaners. I mean, that's a lot of money, and not everybody can afford that. I mean, people that are living with this already are affording, a ton of medical bills.
So us as the city council, what do you want to help families?
Well, these were kind of focused on helping you guys for the public awareness campaign. Not necessarily, actions that, there's some information to help put in those campaigns.
I think your suggestion is a really good one, and that's something that government could do, is provide some sort of stipend to support families, especially if they're already affected by asthma.
There's also the ability, just knowing that vacuuming in your home is kicking up all that dust. I mean, my mom certainly vacuumed around me all the time when I was little.
To keep it clean, so
To
you
keep
were
it clean.
saying.
Yes.
So adding, if you're not able to afford it, at least being aware that that's happening, so that maybe remove your kids from the area you're vacuuming for at least a little while that's all being kicked up, could certainly be a solution.
The other thing is that what we've seen HUD do in some of the subsidized housing areas is to like insure and buy community washers, and also the idea of community vacuums that might be available for people that they could get sufficient equipped $1,000 vacuum that could be shared on a basis. So that's one thing that we see. So why don't I,
Oh,
are
sorry,
there
there's
other
one more
questions?
question.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So have you seen there is huge variation on the home PM 2.5 concentration contrast with outdoor? So that is just due to presence of our fireplace.
No, so indoor air quality is generally poorer than outdoor air quality because you have a lot of mixing outdoors. A lot of pollutants are dispersed, you have lower concentrations, and then indoors it kind of it steals out, it stays there. There's no mixing as much as outdoors.
So can we say 10 microgram per cubic meter increase in outdoor and home? It will be a effect on the same risk to vulnerable population.
Why don't we go back to the slides that showed some of the values, maybe the EPA versus WHO, and looked at that. I can't remember if that was the one that had indoor, outdoor. No, that didn't have indoor, outdoor.
There's no
outdoor.
guidelines for indoor.
But you had here's the mean concentration, yeah. So what you might want to do is suggest what you think the home value should be. Are you suggesting that it is, and I think that's what your question is getting at, are you suggesting that we should try to do measures that would bring it down to outdoor level, or is it sufficient? What else did you show us though about exposure? That we're spending more of our time indoors, isn't that right? So, that would be maybe one you can decide what you want to do, but one idea is to take what you're seeing in one part of the presentation and making a suggestion that you think it should be reduced to the WHO levels indoors,
And I think,
potentially.
Jack could touch on this. There's really no acceptable level of PM as far as health effects on children. So despite the fact that those are the outdoor air quality standards, they could certainly be.
You need to really emphasize that, okay? Because it almost looks like you're endorsing the EPA value here. Okay, so you want to say, what do your observations suggest? And this is an excellent presentation all the way around, really nice. It touched on a lot of key issues. And I thought it was really interesting that you had a very good clarification of your risk question. Notice they didn't go at the causality, they went at the idea of exacerbation. And this is actually, I have to say, the first time I've seen this done in this way for PM, but I think it's really appropriate and a really great idea on this. But we don't talk too much about exacerbating or contributing factors in risk assessment as often as we should, so I actually think that was really great. You also hinted at gene times environment, but it's difficult here. You're not going to exclude everybody that has susceptibility asthma genes and provide them with a different bubble. So I thought it was good to know